And welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be discussing a lot. We're going to be talking about Russia, China, and Iran. The United States at this moment does not appear to be doing particularly well, yet all of our supposed rivals, Russia, China, and Iran being the prime actors among them, seem to be falling flat on their face even harder than we are. In fact, I think it's fair to describe the situation in at least two of these countries as catastrophic, and trending that way in China as well. The question today that I want to discuss is why exactly is this? And I would argue that it's, in fact, the result of a strategy that all three of these countries have adopted on the basis of a really, really fundamental misconception of what the world is and what the world looks like right now. The assumption that all of these folks are making, which is an assumption that many US commentators make as well, is one of US decline. That is the fundamental thesis that the Iranian, Russian, and Chinese elites have allowed themselves to get suckered into. And part of this being suckered into it is the adoption of varieties of strong men strategies. The idea that by being strong and confronting this decaying U.S. colossus, all you have to do is be strong and firm and tough, and then it should be quite easy to sort of tip over U.S. hegemony. That is a thesis that is not working out. That is a thesis that is failing miserably. Iran didn't have too much choice in adopting this thesis, but China and Russia very much did, very much could have gone down a better path. China still has the opportunity to go down a better path. And I think today I hope to demonstrate how this sort of strongman idea, you've just got to be firm, actually ends up just serving U.S. hegemony. I think there's been no greater tool of U.S. dominance in the 21st century than Vladimir Putin. We'll talk about all of that at some more length today. Can you let me know if the sound is coming through okay in the chat? Some preliminaries. You're allowed to say anything, encouraged to say anything about me, the ideas that I'm expressing, my haircut, my appearance, whatever, have at it, mock away, do what you want. What we ask is that you be civil to each other in the chat. Do not be disruptive of the chat. Do not attack other people in the chat. You can attack other people's ideas. Do not attack other people in the chat. We are pretty broad in what you want to say about these things. If you're a big supporter of Russia or China's, strongmen, that's fine. The only thing we ask is that you not engage in any genocidal language on either from any direction. The moderator is Loga Cool Extreme. Listen to what he says. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. If you are acting in a way that he sees as disruptive, he will warn you. And then if you don't listen to him, he will block you for all time. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. So listen to, that's a good comment. Did you piss off your hairdresser? See, that's the kind of comment we welcome here. You can be as abusive of me as you like. And without much further ado, I suppose we should get into it. Fundamentally, this is something that I need to talk about a little bit more. It's been something I've been talking about throughout the existence of this channel. But I think it's something I need to emphasize because it's just so blindingly obvious and nobody's talking about it. It's just that the United States is so much stronger than imagined, so much stronger than we talk about. Its position has always been strong in this century, masked by incredibly stupid decisions we've made, like invading Iraq or electing Donald Trump. But especially in 2022, this is just so blindingly obvious and not being talked about for a number of reasons, primarily because American decline, the idea that the world is getting more dangerous for the United States of America, is at the center of the U.S. military-industrial complex. It's at the center of the fantasy that the United States needs $1 trillion a year to be just shunted into its defense apparatus. The United States is the most secure country in world history. We've used that to build an unparalleled system of dominance and world control. And the story of 2022, especially, but I would argue the story of the 21st century so far is the consolidation and extension of US dominance. I think what's really key here and needs to be emphasized is that the ideology, the propaganda of the Chinese, the Russian strongmen is identical to the propaganda that is put out by the mainstream in the United States. It is in the interest of the U.S. military-industrial complex, and I believe everything from cable news to the New York Times, depending on the day, can be seen as a part of the U.S. military-industrial complex. It is in the interests of the U.S. military-industrial complex to keep people scared. And Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and the mullahs of Iran have handed this incredible gift to the United States on a platter, rather to the United States military-industrial complex on a platter. They have, through their varieties of strongmen strategies, provided exactly the villains that the United States needed to extend and solidify its control of the world. So I'm not just saying that being strongmen is bad for China or Russia. The strongman strategy is bad for China or Russia or Iran. I'm saying it's actively in service to U.S. hegemony. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, these are the guys who are doing the most to make universal U.S. empire happen. And it's because they believe the Pentagon propaganda. If you look at the Chinese think tanks, the Russian think tanks talking about the end of hegemony, the multipolar world that's developing, it's the exact same stuff that the Pentagon's think tanks are churning out because they're both interested in this idea of war and destruction. I think it's worth talking a little bit more about this strongman approach and why it has been so successful in helping Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin consolidate power within their own countries, and has been so incredibly disastrous for anybody who wants the U.S. To have a smaller role in the world. It serves U.S. empire. The question, of course, is the strongman approach justified in some sense? Well, I think that it's very clear that through the 21st century, the United States has made it very clear, has offered a very clear proposition to any country in the world. And that proposition is submit or die. It is you are with us or you are against us. That has been the approach of the United States. We no longer accept any kind of dissent from our coalitions. Russia and China had the choice to remain part of the larger U.S. empire coalition, as they were to an extent in the 90s and the 2000s, and have quite unwisely chosen not to be part of that anymore. I understand from the myths of sovereignty that we talk about, from the standpoint of the idea that countries should be free to make their own choices and go their own way, by that sort of moral framework, by the simple observation of the millions that the United States has killed over the past 20 years, I can see how it's appealing. How you can look at a Xi Jinping or a Vladimir Putin and say, these guys are the heroes standing up against the U.S. aggressor. And I don't particularly believe that, but I can see why people would believe that. But I think it's important to emphasize that if you believe that, they have failed. They have failed miserably and have only brought chaos onto their own countries and created a situation where the United States is more powerful than it has been. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, these are people who are contributing to U.S. power. But it's popular. I think it's important to point out that while all three of these systems, the Iranian, the Russian, and the Chinese, are authoritarian to some degree, there are democratic elements in both the Russian and Iranian systems. The methods that are used to control those democratic systems are much less inelegant, brutal, and even violent in these systems. But the fact is that in Iran, Russia, and even China, there are elements of popular support that are required in order to continue to have a viable government. And this strongman approach, by using Pentagon propaganda about the decline of the US, about how dangerous the world is for the US, um, this strongman approach is popular because the United States is terrifying. The United States has destroyed the Middle East, has declared that it wants to destroy the Iranian government, the Chinese government, and the Russian government. Um, that's terrifying. And you can see how that develops support, whether we're talking about, generic morals or just the completely legitimate urge for self-defense in Russia, China, and Iran. But what I would encourage people who support the Russian, Chinese, or Iranian regimes today to understand is that you're not actually fighting U.S. empire by supporting these regimes. You are solidifying and finalizing U.S. empire. Now, I don't want to claim like everything's going to be fine and hunky dory, U.S. empire forever. The choices that the U.S. government has made over the past 20 years that have, despite all justice and common sense, have worked out well for the United States, have been extraordinarily risky. Basically, we've created a completely unnecessarily chaotic and destructive world environment that we have been best, as the richest and most easily defensible country on the planet, have done the best in capitalizing on. That was an incredibly risky decision. Russia and China both, while there's really the only option that Russia and China have at this juncture, actually no, the only option that Russia has at this juncture, China has many more options, the only option that Russia has at this juncture to stop U.S. empire is nuclear apocalypse. The only way Russia still has the veto on the U.S. controlled world, and that veto is only nuclear apocalypse. U.S. policymakers' actions by inspiring these kinds of strongmen governments in Russia and China have made nuclear war, have made the end of all human existence much, much more possible. That is a very real risk. There's also, it's much diminished now because Vladimir Putin is such a fucking idiot. But there was, prior to February of 2022, and as the decade wears on, more probably in the 2030s and the 2040s, there remains a very real risk of a broader backlash against U.S. empire. That's very real. And I mean, I'm not saying anything about this is permanent, but I am saying that at this point, Russia and China and Iran's sort of strongman opposition, #resistance approaches to the United States have lost. They've lost miserably. They've made the United States much more powerful. They have given the world to the United States. And I think that's what you got to understand about this sort of strongman approach. This idea that, oh, we're going to be the strong resistance to the United States. It's based on a faulty assumption about how quickly the United States is going to decline and fall away. And also, it just works for the United States. It has helped the United States militarize everything. It's a losing strategy, and I think this is key. Unfortunately, this is not an option that Russia has any longer. Russia's committed to this approach. The events of recent weeks, with the mobilization and the referendums, make it clear that Russia is committed on this path as long as there's a Vladimir Putin. That can be 2 months or that can be 10 years. I don't think it's crazy to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the same terms as the Iran-Iraq war. And I think it really could last that long. It's quite horrific what Russia has done here. But you have to understand that it works incredibly well for the United States. It has consolidated U.S. power in ways that Joe Biden couldn't have dreamed of when he was elected president. I think there's a few things that we have to talk about preliminarily before I go into the plight of each of these individual countries. Sorry, the point that I was trying to make, that I'm now back to, is that these are choices. Russia no longer has a choice. Russia can ditch Putin, or it can spend the next 10 years on the Saddam Hussein trail. Those are the options that Russia has right now. China has a lot of options, and China actually has provided a really good example of how you can become incredibly successful in the US system, with a system that is, on a lot of levels, the antithesis of what the US should want. Essentially, you just keep your nose down. You just kiss ass. The United States is tremendously powerful, but does not have the ability to invade and conquer places the way that, say, the British world system, the British Empire did before us. It's too expensive. It just simply isn't something that we can do anymore. I think U.S. war with Iran is a very real possibility, but there's no question of the U.S. actually invading Iran. There's no way we'd try to do that. We'd just fight Iran in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So what China did from the Deng era on was incredibly intelligent. They simply, even after the Tiananmen massacre, they just simply said, well, that's our business, and just sort of, kept their nose down and moved on, became incredibly wealthy, effected an extraordinary economic miracle. That's what China should be doing. That's what Russia should have been doing. Instead, Russia and China Russia more finally chose to play the old game, the old idea that military competition was something that anybody other than the United States could seriously engage in. To qualify that, you can engage in military competition if the United States is stupid enough to get involved on your turf, which is what the United States did with Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and failed miserably doing that. Russia, you'd think, I thought, would have done better in its own sort of hinterland in Ukraine, and it couldn't even manage that. So this idea that military conflict is something that can be engaged in successfully is just wrong. It's that's something that the United States has demonstrated multiple times over the past 20 years. It's something that Russia is in the process of engaging in. And I think that Xi Jinping and the Chinese regime at this point, now contemplating a U.S. president that's pretty much saying, no, we're going to defend Taiwan now, I think realizes, if they have any sense, realizes that invading Taiwan at this point would just be an incredible loser. Unfortunately for Xi Jinping, that's the sort of strongman level on which he has established his position internationally and in domestic Chinese politics, which creates a potential for extraordinary destruction, which we should be very worried about. So yeah, the United States is not declining in the sense that others in the United States is not declining in the terms that the U.S. military wants to talk about and the U.S. media wants to talk about. The United States is not declining in the sense of there's anybody else in the world who is a serious military rival to us. What U.S. media and U.S. government wants is more defense spending, wants more spending on weapons. This is not conspiracy theory. This is just a simple fact if you look at how the work of Congress people and government goes. Defense spending is a business that it's very easy for people in government to control. So despite the fact that it's actually rather a small part of the U.S. economy, it's the part of the U.S. economy that the U.S. government cares about the most. So we are in this position where the United States works really hard, the U.S. government and media works really hard in creating this mythology around U.S. decline, around there being something useful for a U.S. military to do. And there just isn't. There is real U.S. decline in terms of U.S. life expectancy. There is real U.S. decline in terms of the cost of housing, healthcare, and education in this country. There is real U.S. decline in the bottom 80% of the country not being able to participate in the near paradise, precarious but near paradise that the top 20% has created for itself. These are all real problems that need to be addressed, that need to be looked at seriously by the US government. But the people in the US government who'd really rather just keep profiting off of weapons sales don't have to do that because Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, the mullahs of Iran have been stupid enough to play the game that the U.S. military-industrial complex wants them to play, and it's grim from the perspective of the United States because it means we don't actually solve our underlying problems. But this assumption that just because we're not solving our basic underlying problems, that we're somehow on the brink of collapse is just nonsense. The Roman Empire expanded and became more powerful over the course of centuries of immiseration of the Roman people. The United States could very easily do that. And thanks to Vladimir Putin, I think the chances of the United States having at least another 3 decades in which we can immiserate our people while consolidating power over the rest of the world is almost assured at this point. Which is why I think another reason why I think the Iranian, Chinese, and Russian public should just sort of look at what this choice that their leaders have made is doing to them and consider making different choices. So let's talk about Iran. Iran is sort of a special case here. This is not a country that really had a choice as far as the resistance or sort of strongman strategy. It was forced on them repeatedly. Iran's mad mullahs have desperately tried to get back into the world's good graces over and over again. In the 1990s, they were trying to get U.S. oil companies into Iran with as a very conscious choice, as a very conscious understanding that would have been a way to build bridges with the West and allow them to continue to operate their, Islamic theocracy that has always been, actually not, and under MBS it may not be, less repressive than the Saudis. In the 90s, they tried desperately to do that. In 2001, when the United States was attacked by Saudi CIA terrorists based in Afghanistan, Iran helped us conquer Afghanistan. This is something that I keep going back to and just pisses me. You ever wonder why the United States was able to take complete control of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 and then had no power over it after 2002? That's because of the axis of evil speech. Iran was happy to work with us to conquer the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's how we conquered the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they were repaid with the axis of evil speech. Iran in the 2010s signed on to what is probably the most humiliating and one-sided weapons control treaty in human history. If you look at any other arms control agreement, say between the United States and Russia, it is a give and take. It is an equal agreement. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was extraordinarily one-sided. We basically said, give up all these things, submit to all of these advanced levels of inspection, or we starve you to death. Iran said, well, this sucks, and, did what it could to sort of push back against that and retain some dignity, but they signed on. So unlike Russia and China, who made a conscious choice, or at least their leaders made a conscious choice to swallow the lie that the Pentagon was telling them about U.S. decline and opt for a strongman strategy, Iran never really had a choice because, again, the main priority of U.S. government and media is keeping a reason for a massive $1 trillion a year military going, and Iran is like the last, the last competent, potential enemy we had left, especially in the 2000s when Russia and China were much more intelligently playing a part in the U.S. system than attempting to go out and take a gamble on multipolarity. So Iran has, after offering over and over and over again to be friends of the United States, has sort of failed continuously to be able to do that, and has also had to defend itself. When the and Iran, I think, is the only one here that you can look at and describe as something of a success story. The Iranian regime, George W. Bush declared war against them in 2002 with the Axis of Evil speech, from a context where the Afghan, what's the word here? From the context where the United States already occupied Afghanistan within a year of that speech, or I guess within a year and a half of that speech, the United States occupied both Iraq and Afghanistan, and the United States created one of those special situations where we'd put ourselves in such a vulnerable position that a strongman sort of hashtag resistance type movement could screw us over. And that's what the Iranians did. I think people describe the fact that Iranians supported killing U.S. soldiers, soldiers from a country that had declared war against Iran and occupied the country next to it. People describe that as terrorism, and if you describe that as terrorism, then, well, terrorism has no meaning. I mean, it doesn't anymore. And the Iranians quite successfully helped kick the United States most of the way out of Iraq and most of the way out of Syria when we bankrolled the Islamic State and other jihadists to try and destroy the long-standing Iranian ally in Syria. So when the United States does incredibly stupid things, Iran can look successful against us. But that success, that Iranian success, only looks real as long as the United States is willing to continue to do stupid fucking things. And the thing is, you have to understand that Iranian threat is really only valuable to the United States when there's nothing else out there. And in February of 2022, Vladimir Putin was stupid enough to gift the United States an endless sink for weapons and utility. And honestly, it's a situation unparalleled in my adult life. It's a situation where the United States is helping the good guys in Ukraine. It's amazing. So what we've got in Iran is a situation where, hopefully, as people begin to realize just how long this Russia-Ukraine fight is going to go, the United States is hopefully going to just back off progressively. That's what we would have done in February if there were anybody sane. And if we just back off, the Iranian regime is going to have a lot less to do in terms of look like a heroic defender, and is just going to be further and further driven into the situation where they are right now, which is they are a fanatical, extremist government run by a bunch of guys 10 to 20 years, 20 years plus older than me, and I'm a middle-aged guy, overseeing an absolutely brutalized population that has been starved to death by U.S. sanctions and is being beaten down with a idiotic religious orthodoxy that the majority of the population of Iran can't even understand why people, why their elders thought it was a good idea in the first place. So you've got the situation in Iran where the adoption or even tolerance of the radical Islam that the leadership espouses has plummeted dramatically. The only thing that the Iranian regime has to hold it in power at this point is this sort of strongman resistance vibe. If the United States would just lift the sanctions and stop allowing Syria to stop allowing Israel to do terror attacks on Iranian soil, I think the Iranian regime would fall rather quickly. Um, we've got a inspiring protest movement going in Iran right now. Masa Amini, a young woman who I think there's a little bit more to this. It's not just that she was a woman with hijab. She was also a Kurdish woman with hijab who was targeted by the virtue police or what have you in Iran. I doubt that a woman, an affluent woman in Tehran, would be treated the same way that she was treated, but that's another aspect of the injustice of the Iranian regime. She was essentially murdered by virtue police. Maybe there's more to the story than that, but regardless, if you're in a situation, you're in a country where you can have virtue police that could be plausibly seen as murdering a woman for not having appropriate headgear, it's obviously an incredibly illegitimate regime and a disgusting one. And I think it's very sad that the United States has legitimized this regime with our attacks on Iran for the past 40 years. We've seen over and over again when there was a slight let up of aggression under the Clinton years, reform broke out all over Iran, and that was 30 fucking years ago. Iran is clearly primed to primed for a new regime. All we have to do is stop trying to destroy it. I know this seems counterintuitive, but it's just basic physics. The Iranian regime exists because of 40 years of U.S. aggression against the Iranian regime. Whenever we let up, it becomes much more fragile. I think the JCPOA is pretty much a lost cause at this point. The U.S. military-industrial complex, thanks to Vladimir Putin, now has better things to do. I think that the right thing to do would just be to lift all of Obama's sanctions and allow Iran to sink or swim. It's to the world's benefit to get access to their oil and gas for the next couple of years. So we should just lift all the sanctions. The JCPOA is dead. Trump killed it. Just let that go. And I think if we did that, I think we'd very quickly find the Iranian regime evaporating. That's not going to happen. We're going to keep Iran miserable. We're going to keep talking about, oh, yes, we love the Iranian people as they engage in this set of protests that are going to be horrifically crushed. The set of protests 2 years from now that gets horrifically crushed. The set of protests 4 years from now that gets horrifically crushed. And we're going to continue holding on to, if not increasing, our murderous sanctions that have utterly destroyed Iran's economy. So I have a little bit more sympathy with the Iranian regime than I do with the Russian or Chinese governments because they didn't really choose this. They've been forced into this, first by U.S. imperialism through the Shah, the government that was before the Islamic Revolution. The Islamic Revolution was consolidated by U.S. allied attacks against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War that lasted an incredibly vicious decade, killing 1 million people. It's just stuff that keeps on happening. And I'm afraid that it's going to continue happening. Now, Russia and China, I have a lot less sympathy with. Thank you so much, Jay, for your super chat. I try not to, if folks could hold off with their super chats until I am done with the presentation, that would be better because I don't have the bandwidth to try and make it through my presentation and also talk about. But let's see, we probably won't get Western-leaning CCP leader until after the Cultural Revolution generation is gone. That being said, she isn't the worst. One of the heroes of the Cultural Revolution, CCCP leader. We'll talk about Xi Jinping in a second. But Jay, thank you so much for the super chat. If folks could just hold off on the super chat until until I'm done with the presentation. Okay, so that's Iran. Yes, solidarity with Masa Amini, but I don't have high hopes for the end of the Iranian regime until the main support of the U.S. of the Iranian regime U.S. hardliners and their aggression against Iran are just cut it out. Just stop doing that. Stop attacking Iran, and we will be shocked by how quickly the Iranian regime disappears. Now, China and Russia. Well, let's talk about Russia. Russia is so screwed, and it's very sad. I think that there's a lot of U.S. culpability in this, a lot of lack of U.S. support for Russia's transition from communism, a lot of U.S. and European endorsement of the sort of foul sink of corruption that took over in Russia. I think that it's pretty transparently obvious to me that NATO expansion is the main reason that this conflict in Ukraine happened. It's pretty transparently obvious to me that almost all of the reporting we get on Russia is biased nonsense. But you know what? None of that matters anymore because Vladimir Putin was stupid enough to turn him, to pretend he had the power. He pulled a poor man's George W. Bush move, and he's not the United States. He doesn't have the support of the United States. I am really interested in hearing from people about their grievances with their neighbor. I think that Russia had a lot of very rational grievances with their neighbor, both Ukraine personally and Europe more generally, and the United States, of course. I stopped being interested in hearing about your grievances with your neighbor when you stab your neighbor. It was Russia and Vladimir Putin that made the choice to start a shooting war in Europe that's probably killed 100,000 people by now. That's on Russia. That's on Vladimir Putin. And I think that's the biggest example of just like where this strongman bullshit leads. Because if you're going to adopt this sort of strongman philosophy, you have to believe that you can plausibly be successful with it. And we don't live in that world. We don't live in a world where a strongman approach is going to be successful. It's incredibly sad that Russia and China, to a degree, have looked at the lessons of incredible U.S. failure over the past 20 years in attempting to do sort of 19th century imperialism. And instead of taking the appropriate response to that, like, oh, wow, look, conquering countries looks like a really bad idea for anybody. They just sort of decided, no, it's the U.S. that's failing and we can do it. And wow, is that just getting absolutely smashed. Just an absolute extraordinary mismatch, extraordinary failure. I think that folks who oppose Russia, the sort of general Twitter, the Twitter industrial complex or what have you, folks that I find myself agreeing with more and more since February 2022, I think they're getting out ahead of themselves a little bit. I think they're assuming that because this mobilization that Russia has chosen to engage in has been such a chaotic mess over the past week, I think they're assuming that Russia is weaker than it is. I think they are mistaking. Look at Iran. Iran certainly has just gotten further and further isolated, further and further economically crushed down. But Iran is emphatically still there. And I think it's a tremendous mistake to look at Russia and assume that because a mobilization has gone poorly, because an offensive has gone poorly, that Russia is on the brink of collapse. I think that is entirely wrong. It is just as big a mistake to assume, and people make this assumption, well, less so now, sort of made these assumptions with Russia. I don't think they ever made them with Iran, that like Russia was on the cusp of like becoming this new powerful actor. Russia is not on the cusp of becoming a new powerful actor. But that does not mean that it cannot endure and make this conflict between Russia and Ukraine much, much longer, much, much more violent, much, much more horrifically bloody. Is there a chance that Putin will be gone by the end of the year and we'll have a new leadership in Russia that's looking for some kind of deal? 100%. Is it possible that Vladimir Putin will be in power for another 10 years and the Russia-Ukraine conflict becomes something of the intensity, of much more intensity and violence and destruction than the Iran-Iraq war that continued throughout the 1980s, that is also very possible. So I think I think the general tenor of Western coverage that Russia's going to lose this thing is correct. I think Russia has already lost this thing on so many levels that we'll get into. But that does not mean that Ukraine wins. I think Ukraine will probably win eventually. I think Europe will probably win eventually. But the amount of death and destruction that we're going to go through on the path towards Russia getting ground down and humiliated is so high that I think it's very worthwhile to go for any kind of deal that the Ukrainians are willing to accept. Yeah, no, I think there's a real chance that this conflict could go on for a significant chunk of the 2020s. Again, that gets worse and worse for Russia the longer it goes on. We're seeing this morning, the big news is that the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is now out of commission, completely out of commission. This is probably, I haven't looked, it's probably causing a big spike in oil and gas prices. But it's also not entirely clear. I think a lot of people are assuming that this is something that Russia did. I think probably, yeah, it's something that Russia did, but there are a lot of other people who could have done it. And I think what it means is that in the short term, yes, prices spike a little bit, prices get a little more difficult, but also Russia has lost another way of selling its oil and gas, selling its gas. And I think that that's sort of the thing that's going to happen. I assumed, and everybody assumed, a much higher level of destruction in terms of Europe, the world in general, due to the loss of Russian oil and gas. To be clear, Russia is still getting a lot of its oil and gas out. I think it's probably still, in some, I think on some metrics, they might be getting more oil out or what have you. But they are getting much less money for it, and their ability to produce is declining remorselessly. The fact that Nord Stream 1 is apparently been destroyed, I'm seeing more and more, who knows, perhaps there's better reporting. I'm already 45 minutes out from whatever was going on there. So I think this conflict is going to be longer than people on either side are expecting. But I think the end game of this for Russia is sort of like Saddam Hussein type. Obviously, Russia is a bigger, wealthier, just physically larger place than Iraq. But I do think that a very long period of being ground down for no victory, for no discernible success, is what is happening for Russia going forward. There's something I want to look at. Whenever I mention that Russia is losing, people love to throw this in my face. Look at that. So you have here Russian ruble to the United States dollar. In February, March, so it was late February is when Russia invaded Ukraine. The ruble tanked, lost almost half its value against the United States. And then, as time went on, and it became clear that Russia's oil and gas was not going to be immediately disrupted to the extent that folks had imagined. And also it became more and more difficult for Russia to import things. The ruble had a miraculous improvement. It's actually stronger. The ruble is significantly stronger. You know, it's 16, we've got 0.16. We've gotten, math. Anyway, it's gone up. It's gone from 0.014 to 0.016. That's lovely. Okay, so that's true. The ruble is stronger than when it invaded Ukraine. But why don't we take a look at where the ruble is since Russia decided to opt for the resistance, the strongman approach? Okay, we're going to invade Georgia. Okay, we're going to invade Ukraine. That's what it looks like. In 2008, that's that first peak, and then a valley there. That's when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Georgia in 2008. And then in 2014, you can see his initial invasion of Ukraine. The ruble today is worth about half of what it was when he initially went into Ukraine. And this decline is only going to continue. It's only going to get worse. There's a lot of folks who are really invested in the narrative of Russia is going to destroy everything. I was pushing this narrative. Like, this really changes everything, this screws up everything. What has been surprising even to me, but still largely unacknowledged, I think, by a lot of folks, is just how, that's what I'm looking for, how resilient the world system has been, despite the loss of a lot of Russian oil and gas, and the way that it's continued to be resilient. I think that you're not going to get documentation of this on most YouTube channels, most Twitter folks, most online pundits. I'm thinking of like Peter Zeihan. I'm thinking of like Doomberg. I'm thinking of like Zero Hedge. These places that are just sort of like, chaos is happening. Europe's going to freeze to death, etc., etc., etc. Now, don't get me wrong. This is an incredible dislocation. We are going to see. We've already seen huge pain in developing countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan. We're going to see great pain in Africa that should not be. I think mass starvation in Africa is probably oversold, but it's entirely possible. We'll see. But this idea that Europe was going to be so incredibly inconvenienced by this change is something that I believed in March. A lot of people believed in March, and is just dissipating. No question, Europe has been pushed into recession. The UK, famously, this week has been just absolutely economic chaos. I don't know how to refer to it other than it's been quite shocking. But that's got a lot more to do with Brexit. That's got a lot more to do with a solid decade now of Conservative Party mismanagement. Certainly, Russia-Ukraine helps. What's interesting is looking at serious thinkers who, in March, not folks who are marketing disaster like Zeihan or Doomberg or Zerahedge, looking at serious thinkers who, in March, were like, "Holy shit, this is disastrous for the world. We're all screwed. Europe's gonna lose everything, etc., etc., etc." Looking at folks who were there in March and now in most of October are kind of like, well, actually, it's probably going to be okay. Specifically, I'm thinking of, I am a big fan of Bloomberg's Odd Lots podcast. I don't know if you guys are following it. So much so that I actually went and saw a live debate in New York City recently. But what's really interesting is, so these aren't folks who are selling you some kind of narrative or trying to sell you books about the end of the world like Peter Zeihan. These are finance folks. I'm thinking specifically of, now not the Odd Lots podcast, they just have people on, but I'm thinking of people that the Odd Lots podcast have had on in spring of this year and then had on in the fall of this year, and just how extraordinary the switch is. These are people whose job is making money off of finance, off of trading, off of financial wizardry, not off of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not off of selling you scary books about the end of the world. This week they had Pierre Adnerand on, who I believe runs a oil and gas. I know he runs a hedge fund. I'm not entirely certain that it is petroleum oriented, but he has enough expertise that he is able to talk as if he is an expert, and has apparently made a good deal of money in this arena. In March, he went on the Odd Lots podcast and talked about how he believed that it was entirely possible. I still believe it's possible, and I agree with him on this, that we would have oil cost $200 a barrel. Today, oil costs $80 a barrel. This is a guy who was talking about serious crises for Europe, for the winter, what have you. He was on Odd Lots this week, and he said, what Europe has to do is most Europeans are going to have to turn their thermostats to 19 degrees Celsius instead of 22 degrees Celsius this winter. That's a huge, huge walk back. Now, don't get me wrong. Like things are disrupted, things are disastrous, things are. I'm really worried about what's going to happen in Africa this winter. But a lot of the folks, the serious folks, who were talking about how this Russia disruption was going to be the end of anything, have been pleasantly surprised to find that that's simply not the case. Another example would be Zoltan Pozsar. He was, I think he's a banker for Credit Suisse. He came on to Odd Lots, was it 5, 6 months ago, was talking about Bretton Woods 3, how actually what this meant was we're going to see a whole new currency system where actually what matters is commodities, and maybe the U.S. would do okay out of it, but clearly, the Gulf countries or Russia or Indonesia were going to be the big winners now under Bretton Woods 3. And I went and saw this debate, and it was fascinating just seeing how far Zoltan Pozsar had retreated from this position, like, oh, it's the dollar's going to collapse. It's time for the new financial system. The sort of multipolarity nonsense that China and Russia have been pushing. China and Russia and the Pentagon have been pushing for 2 decades now. And then 6 months later in this live debate, he was like, well, yeah, I think eventually things are going to be bad for the dollar because, of course, the main financial story over the past 3 months or so has been the insane, extraordinary strength of the dollar. So yeah, I think you're never going to get Zero Hedge and Peter Zeihan to admit that the catastrophe isn't happening. But if you just look at people whose job is actually making money off of trading, if you pay attention to them, it's becoming pretty clear that the catastrophe has been delayed, isn't happening. And the United States has actually been able to consolidate its position majorly because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Okay, that's all I've got to say about Russia. What do I have to? Well, it's been almost an hour. What do I have to say about China? China is in a completely different situation from Russia in that it still has choices it can make. And I think the wisest choice would be to jettison Xi Jinping, obviously. Because China had demonstrated for decades under Deng Xiaoping and his successors that they were more than capable of finding success in the U.S.-led system. It's only the Xi Jinping, which was a reaction. Xi Jinping is a reaction to balls-out aggression from a United States. Obama's pivot to Asia, everything about Trump's lingo, Biden, out there aggression from the United States that looked like a really obvious loser because we'd failed to do straight up 19th century imperialism in the Middle East. It was a gamble. It was something they could have done, and I think that if they'd managed the Trump thing better, if Xi Jinping had the presence of mind to actually present himself as a real alternative, different hegemon, then I think there's a real chance that Xi Jinping could have been successful, but he failed miserably. He went with Strongman, and he allowed himself to be portrayed as so. Like, I think there's a lot of people who are willing to make an argument for what they did in Xinjiang. I think they're crazy. I think there's no dispute. There's a lot of unprincipled fanatics pushing the idea of genocide in Xinjiang, but the Chinese government's own outlets have admitted that there are concentration camps there, have admitted mass re-education. So the bare bones of the story, even if it is being pushed by unprincipled fanatics, are true. Genocide isn't a term I use. Crimes against humanity, concentration camps, those are terms I would use. So even if you're a big, fan of the Chinese regime and you think that there was some legitimate security problem there, like over the past decade, it's not like Afghanistan was going to invade, Like even if you believe there was some real security problem there, it's an incredible own goal for the Chinese to double down on the repression of Xinjiang in the way that they have, because it gave an incredible gift to folks who want to portray China as evil. The crushing of Hong Kong is the same thing. It's just things that Xi Jinping seem rational to Xi Jinping under the mythology of this idea that the United States is declining in a military sense, that are just that just work for the United States and allow the United States to justify doing a whole bunch of things that it would like to do, that it wanted to do for a while anyway. Um, yeah, the South China Sea stuff is another good example. It's just sad face saving efforts that make U.S. aggression so much easier. And I think China, unlike Russia, unlike sadly Iran, I think still has real opportunities here. There's still a lot of U.S. money wrapped up in the Chinese economy. There's still a lot of people who'd like to continue trying to get rich off of China, instead of doing this sort of Cold War, new Cold War nonsense. It would take a really big shift for China to take itself off of its trajectory. I think they'd probably have to ditch Xi Jinping, and they should do that. All right, so I think that's about an hour of me talking. Yo, gosh, that's a full hour of me talking about stuff. Let's see. Let me see about the super chat. There was another one that so Jay, talking about we probably won't get Western-leaning CCP leader until after the Cultural Revolution generation is gone. That being said, she isn't the worst. One of the heroes of the Cultural Revolution, a CCP leader. What does it mean to be Western-leaning CCP leader? I mean, like, I don't quite follow that. I mean, Deng Xiaoping was arguably a very Western-leaning CCP leader. Throughout I mean, China and the United States were kind of allies through the last decade of the Cold War. And I think that up until Xi Jinping, you had no Chinese leader that really sort of stepped out, unless, the United States did something like, oh, I don't know, bomb Chinese embassy in Serbia. You didn't have Chinese leaders position themselves as so anti-U.S. or powerfully as this idea of multipolarity or competition. So I just don't think it would be that much of a out of character thing for China to just sort of like back off a bit, and pick a leader that operated with the same assumptions as Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin. I apologize for my pronunciation. I obviously don't pronounce things good. We have got from UC Lee. Bedtime. We'll watch the replay tomorrow. We have replay, right? Yes, we do have replay. Thank you so much for the super chat. Love the content. Say something positive about People's Republic of China. I think China has the potential to get back on track, and I think if China were to spend another 20 years trying to do the peaceful rise thing, I think that China would. My assumption remains that a big part of the story of the 21st century will be about U.S. competition with China. I think China's incredible mistake over the past decade has been assuming that they are now at a point where they can engage in some kind of militarized, dick-waving, strongman competition with the United States. They're not there yet. If China had the presence of mind to get back towards a more peaceful rise dynamic, then yeah, 20, 30 years from now, I think China absolutely could seriously compete with the United States. There's another super chat. A bunch of guys 20 plus years older than me, brutalized population, beaten down by an idiotic religion. That's like great. Christopher Murtaugh says, so this is quoting what I just said about Iran. A bunch of guys 20 plus years older than even middle-aged me, a brutalized population, beaten down by an idiotic religious orthodoxy that the majority can't understand. Sounds like the United States and Iran have similar problems. Touche. Touche, Christopher. I think there's a lot of truth there, but in the United States, we hopefully will see at these midterm elections a peaceful way to get back at these clowns who believe they can tell women how to dress and how to live their lives and whether or not even have children. Whereas I think if as should happen, the United States has the sense to give serious victory to the Democrats. I don't mean like you're not going to see any kind of like wave election or massive victory for the Democrats, but I do think that the choice to attempt to ban abortion much more seriously that the Republican Party is engaged in over the past 6 months or so should blow up in their faces. And unfortunately, I think the Iranian regime is going to be able to weather the Masa Amini storm without any kind of real. Let's see. Jay says, sorry about the spelling. My autocorrect wasn't working well. What I mean is that the current CCP leadership is a product of their upbringing, e.g. culture. Deng had a Western upbringing? Really? I didn't, what, like, so what, he was, Deng Xiaoping had a, meaning what? Deng Xiaoping was raised by missionaries in China? That is very new to me. The idea that Deng had a Western upbringing. But the current CCP culture, well, the current CCP leadership, a lot of CCP leadership defines itself in opposition to the Cultural Revolution. I think there's differing levels. It obviously varies on but whatever where the political winds are going at that moment. But I think there's differing levels of condemnation of the Cultural Revolution. I think under Xi Jinping, as things are getting a little more Maoist and a little more doctrinaire, there's probably less complaining about the Cultural Revolution. But I think under Deng, there was a real, even at some points, even quite open acknowledgement that the Cultural Revolution was a mistake and that one-man government had led to problems. Obviously, under Xi Jinping, now the idea that there might be a problem with one-man government is becoming less popular. But I think it wasn't even Xi Jinping, wasn't his family targeted by the Cultural Revolution? I thought that was part of his biography. Reynold Cherry, foreign policy Twitter have been stating current Iran protests are U.S.-led color revolutions. Thoughts? I think that no question that the United States supports in many forms resistance to our sort of official rival countries. But I think that the very glib writing off of these revolutions as if there's nothing to them other than outside funding is kind of nonsense. And I think really Afghanistan, of all places, provides this incredible, okay, so if the U.S. is so freaking all-powerful and has this ability to create and mold any society, then how do you explain Afghanistan, where like literally hundreds of billions of dollars and complete U.S. control of the country did not lead to anything sustainable? I think that, yeah, so I think there's some truth. I think that 100% the United States carried out a coup in Ukraine in 2014. I think that's true, but that doesn't mean that there weren't people in Ukraine who legitimately wanted to get rid of Yanukovych. Both of those things can be true, and just this, I think this like blanket disqualification or this idea that you can, whenever there's a protest against anybody anywhere, you can go, oh, that's a color revolution, so that's nonsense and that's not real, is bullshit. I think it's similarly bullshit to like people in the United States being like, oh, Russia did this, it's Russia's fault. It's Russia's fault that people don't like, that people are a little unnerved by the progress of gay rights, or it's Russia's fault that, no, man, it's just like politics is politics. And in any functioning country, there's dissent. And if you don't provide outlets for that dissent, you're going to get protests. Does the United States take advantage of these protest movements? Yeah. Does the United States, honestly, to the detriment of these protest movements, try to insert itself? Yeah. But can you just say, oh, that's nonsense because the U.S. happens to be against the regime that is being protested against? I do not like Deng was educated in his France in his teens. I did not know that. That is so interesting. Thank you, Jay. I really did not know that. Eric Magnuson, well, thanks for keeping me informed. Well, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you for that super chat, Eric Magnuson. So foreign policy Twitter has been stating that current Iran protests are U.S.-led color revolution. Yeah, so I like. Of course, there's U.S. support for women in Iran, like cultural support, moral support, financial support. Yes, but like, yeah, I really dislike the idea that we have to ignore a protest just because the U.S. has supported it in some way. Yeah. Um, What do you make of the fake Chinese coup rumors? Asks Etienne. I always sort of had a sense that they were fake. What I would like to see is I would like to see Xi Jinping through semi-official corporate bureaucratic looking procedures lose power at the 5 year Congress coming up. I think it's what mid or late October every 5 years. The Chinese Communist Party has a big Congress. Before Xi Jinping, it was at every second Congress, power would shift. I would like to see a formal ousting of Xi Jinping at this party Congress. It's probably the only thing that will let me take China seriously, that would convince me to take China seriously over the next decade, is if Xi Jinping is ousted. I think that the benefits that China could get from ousting Xi Jinping, I think, would be lost if it were a coup. So if I mean, obviously there are going to be elements of this that would have to be somewhat coup-like. It's an oligarchy. It's a weird. Nobody really knows what's going on behind the scenes, that sort of thing. But this idea that there'd be like a military coup and then Xi Jinping would just disappear. I don't, I suppose that's possible, but it didn't strike me as particularly likely. And I think to do that way would actually would sacrifice a lot of the benefits that China would get from ousting Xi Jinping in a more plausibly official kind of way, if that makes any sense. Do you think the U.S. government, Sarah Pulsar asks, do you think the U.S. government believed that there were nukes in Iraq prior to the invasion, or do you think they knew it wasn't true? It's an interesting question. Like, I think that enough people in the United States establishment convinced themselves that it was true. Like, do I think that, like, I think you can underestimate how stupid the people in power are. Like, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are fucking idiots. Like, they have basically believed Pentagon propaganda about U.S. weakness and decided to take their countries in directions based on that. Like, I don't think that Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping know that they're doing U.S. work by providing an excuse to up U.S. defense budgets. I don't think they know that, but I think that's how they're working in practice. I think that the U.S. military, at every level of the U.S. military, from Dick Cheney down to the officer class anyway, like, folks were aware that they needed something to do, and they were also aware that Saddam Hussein was legitimately a very bad guy. And even though there were plenty of folks who knew their business and turned out to be entirely accurate, it was at Hans Blix, other UN, IAEA folks, international folks who were entirely correct in saying, yeah, Iraq doesn't have any of this stuff. I can see why. So it's like, yeah, like, were there fraudulent people? I mean, look at, like, the Steele dossier, right? Like, utter bullshit. All this sort of stuff that was concocted about Donald Trump. But there are probably only very few people, and possibly no people, who knew or believed that it was utter nonsense. Because if an institution convinces itself of a certain ideology, it's going to just keep going in that direction. I'm not sure if I'm being helpful here, Star Pulsar. Is it like, were there, I think that the way that power works, or the way that it works for people, is that, like, no matter how dumb the evidence was, no matter how lacking the evidence was, the Bush administration and the U.S. military-industrial complex had convinced themselves that that Saddam Hussein was bad and evil, and he probably had weapons of mass destruction. So it didn't really matter to them what evidence was preferred, was used, because they believed it anyway. Because people are stupid. I hope that was helpful, Sarah. Jan or John, do you think Russia will keep the territory it annexed, or will annex? No, I really don't. And I think that before this week, I thought that the most likely result was that Russia would hold on to Crimea, because Crimea, I think I was talking about this on Twitter, but it was sort of confirmed recently, and, well, not confirmed, but I think I was already talking about this on Twitter, but it was mentioned by a much more serious commentator, supposedly, Michael Kaufman, recently, which is what Russia has done over the past week is massively delegitimize their 2014 referendum in Crimea. So in 2014, I believe that Russia actually did semi-legitimately. Of course, it was fraudulent. Of course, it was under duress, whatever, but did, more or less legitimately win. I don't think 95% of Crimeans in 2014 wanted to be part of Russia, but I easily believe 60, 70, 80% did. They won, they had this referendum over territory that they completely controlled, Crimea, in 2014. And now they are doing this fucking horse shit over territory they do not control, over territory where their referenda are clearly massively illegitimate. So what they're doing, fundamentally, I think the main thing they're doing with these referendums is delegitimizing their earlier referendum in Crimea. So I think prior to this week, I'd said, in the final settlement, it's almost certain that Russia's going to end up with Crimea permanently. I think what they're doing now is they're shutting down any kind of potential for negotiation, and by using the same sort of referendum process that they used to take control of Crimea, except infinitely less legitimate, they're actually besmirching or screwing up whatever rights to Crimea they could have claimed. So they're now, I think they had an argument that they could make about their Crimea referendum. Obviously, no one in the U.S. would concede that it was free or fair or appropriate or this, that, and the other thing. But that Crimea referendum was definitely much more legitimate than the referenda that are going on in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. I'm not going to try. And Donetsk and Luhansk right now. So yeah, I think it's a tremendous fuck up on their part. So yeah, I think still, if they had made a deal in April, I think they would have probably been able to, have Crimea confirmed in their possession. Even maybe Donetsk and Luhansk, or Donetsk and Luhansk at that point would have perhaps just kept in their weird, nasty limbo. But yeah, this sort of referendum thing, this is an overreach. This is a really stupid overreach that guarantees a longer conflict, but I think also makes it more likely that at the end of the conflict, Russia doesn't even have the 4 republics it's trying to annex now. It doesn't have Crimea anymore. I think that made that more likely. I'm still up in the air. I think there's probably a good chance that Russia, whether in a 2-month, in a war that lasts another 2 months or lasts another 10 years, I think there's still a pretty good chance that Russia could hold on to Crimea, but it's a lot less likely than it was last week, because they really, really impacted the legitimacy of the Crimea referendum. Really fucking stupid. Thoughts on Brazil's election on the 2nd? God damn, that's here already, man. I hope and I pray that that Lula wins by a big enough margin that Bolsonaro can't steal it. I think that's most of what I have to say about Brazil's election on the 2nd. It would just be really shitty to see Brazil destabilized the way that Bolsonaro seems to have been promising he would. I haven't looked at the polling recently. I should have. Maybe somebody in the comments wants to talk about where Brazil's polling is. My thing on that is that so Bolsonaro has made it pretty clear that he, like Trump, won't believe that any election that he loses is legitimate. But uh, Trump believes that he won't. Sorry, this is Bolsonaro. Um, if Lula, this is the old president who's running again, if Lula wins by 3 to 5%, then I think we've got a serious constitutional crisis and maybe a coup and maybe, uh, I mean, I don't know about civil war, yeah, maybe even large scale violence in Brazil. If Lula wins by like 10 to 15 to 20%, well, then, no, people aren't, in order to do a coup, in order to start a violent insurrection, you need people on your side. You need people who aren't just your like weird fanatic followers. You need more serious right leaning people or what have you to be on your side. Like if Trump hadn't just lost 4 states in 2020, if he'd just lost one or two, then Jesus Christ, I mean, who knows? It's entirely possible that there would have been. I think Trump would still most likely have found himself out of power, but it would have been a much more open, much more nasty situation. So yeah, my desperate hope is that Bolsonaro, who's been a pretty cataclysmic failure, so cataclysmic that the Economist that endorsed him has now abandoned him, which is really hard for the Economist because any right wing Latin American politician is their friend naturally. Um, so yeah, my desperate hope in Brazil's elections upcoming is that Lula wins by like 10 to 15%, a large enough margin where like the Brazilian generals are like, yeah, screw off Bolsonaro. That's my great hope for Brazil's elections on the second. Oh wow, a lot of super chats. I'm falling behind. Always grateful for your thoughtful commentary, Rob, says Alan. Do you think Russia may resort to using tactical nukes post referenda? I think there's a lot of other things that have to go very wrong before Russia starts using nukes. I think that the Russian mobilization is going to have much more serious impacts. Um, I think that the Russian mobilization is going to, I don't know, over the next 2 or 3 months, I could see Ukraine taking big swaths of territory, but I could also see that being sort of like the last chance for another six months to another couple of years. Because once the Russian mobilization, the big problem in Kherson was that Ukraine put pressure on one part of the line. The big pressure in Kharkiv for Russia was that Ukraine put pressure on one part of the line. Russia had, put its best troops to face off of that part of the line, and then they'd basically left it kind of empty. There just weren't that many serious troops left in Kharkiv. That problem, that possibility, seems to largely be over. I believe Ukraine will eventually win this war, but it's going to require a much higher level of training, intensity, and arming by the United States and Europe to do that. And I think that's something that's going to happen over the course of years. I think Russia's mobilization is going to allow them in the short term, possibly even to take more territory. I think it's going to be really interesting how Belarusian politics go. I haven't made a study of that recently. I think with all of these mobilized, I think at this point, the mobilized troops in Russia are just being thrown into shoring up the defensive lines, probably making what happened in Kharkiv that was so exciting for the Ukrainian side impossible. And then I think maybe 3 to 6 months from now, you could see these retrained, expanded units, maybe another attack on Kyiv. It's possible. I mean, this is war. It's real war now. How that would work with Belarusian politics, how Europe or the U.S. would respond, I don't know. I don't think that this mobilization is going to allow Russia to win. but I don't think we're going to see, at least for another couple years, Russia. So what's going to happen? The way I see it is that mobilization is going to stop any kind of Ukrainian victories, might even result in some pushing back that the Ukrainians will be able to successfully resist. I think what's going to happen um, mid 2023 is we're going to start seeing some real financial hardship in Russia, real problems supplying anybody, and more prioritization of getting those resources to the front, of Russia being consumed more and more by this fight. Um, so maybe in 2023, 2024, we can start talking about nuclear threats. I kind of wonder, obviously, red lines don't go very well, but I do feel like we should just make it clear that if Russia does, yeah, I don't know. No, red lines are always bad. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's many more escalation steps for this conflict before nuclear weapons. I also think that the U.S. Does tend to oversell the possibility of other people using nuclear weapons. We're the only folks who've done that. We're also the only folks who like building newer and bigger and more destructive nuclear weapons. Um, because again, we like weapons in the United States. That's what our government and media are organized around. But yeah, no, I wouldn't say it's impossible. World War III. I'd say, yeah, World War III is more likely than it's been at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it would be nice if more people were more serious about that. But I do think there's a lot of escalation steps to go through um, before we're talking about tactical nukes. C Shorty, well, I love it. C Shorty, would it be possible for you to do a video on ways that U.S. power has grown? It is not just possible. I think that should be that is my next produced video. I think that's something I'm hopefully going to have out next Tuesday. We'll see. So yeah, that is definitely something that I am writing right now. C Shorty. Specifically, it's just that like I think that people. I did a short on this a little while back, but I don't. I think people are not really paying attention to just how completely the United States has eviscerated what looked like its biggest rival in the year 2000, which was the European Union. And I think I'm going to start from that and then talk about how the United States has really been essentially victorious, frickin' everywhere, which is kind of ridiculous, but also the truth. Okay. Sarah Pulsara, do you think Russia will take troops out of Armenia, Syria, and Transnistria to refill the ranks of the front line? I feel like I get this question fairly often, and my answer is no. I think that all of these positionings of U.S. troops of Russian troops are so small that it doesn't really make sense for them. So they're so small, and the value that they provide in terms of Russian prestige, the idea that Russia is a big player in the world, has peacekeeping slash, Assad preserving troops. This is prestige for Russia that comes at so little cost that it's unlikely that they would pull those troops out. Now, I believe they've already taken certain elements out of Armenia, Syria, what have you. Like, I don't think they're going to ban these places entirely, but certainly, more high-tech units as weapons have been expended. Yeah, there's been a huge amount. I mean, not huge amount, but yeah, like as things are more useful on the Ukrainian battlefront, they're certainly taken out of those places. But I think the idea that they would be entirely taken out doesn't make much sense to me because, again, Russia gets a lot of prestige from these relatively small commitments. Does the EU have a future? I would say yes. Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Surprisingly, in 2015-16, I looked at I looked at a bunch of stuff related to the European Union, and my take was like, this place is about to fall apart. Like, it's a mess. Like, there's no way they can sustain it. I think what I didn't fully reckon with was just how important Europeans consider the European Union. How largely, um, with the exception of a particularly dumb, now dead group of British people, um, I think most Europeans, despite all its failings, still like the idea of Europe, still prefer it to what they know of their own incredibly violent history. I would imagine that as folks have focused more and more on the rise of China and India, and that has sunk in over the past century, over the past 2 decades, I think probably more and more Europeans have realized that if they're going to have any hope of having real influence on the world stage in this century or any of the following centuries, they desperately need to have the scale of the EU. So yeah, I think the EU has a massive future. I think that it's had a really bad couple decades, largely I think due to abuse by the United States. That is going to continue to be a problem because Vladimir Putin pushed them fully back into U.S. dependence. But yeah, I think the EU has a long and bright future, honestly. Yeah, one great indicator would be I think in 2014, 2015, the right wing threat to the EU was the main problem. It seemed like the most likely way that the EU would end. We've seen, I think, with the Sweden Democrats, I think that came up in brief research I did for a short. Certainly with the Italian Eurosceptic parties, and now definitely with Giorgia Meloni, who looks likely to be the hard right prime minister of Italy, thanks to a recent election. All of these countries, all of these right wing parties, they hold on to their hatred of immigrants. But they, as soon as they get in power, and in many cases before they come to power, as is the case with Giorgia Meloni, they drop the Euroscepticism. Meloni is a huge advocate for Ukraine, and also Russia has helped make the EU look more powerful and more valuable. Yeah. Jack Hawkins, Pakistan. That's a great question. I have shamefully not looked in on Pakistan recently. They obviously have tremendous political problems. They have Imran Khan, who's largely seen as a fairly popular Pakistani leader who was ousted by the military. That's an issue. The country, Imran Khan, is probably counting his lucky stars to not be in power during an extraordinary, probably climate-related catastrophe that Pakistan has been experiencing over the past month or so. Extraordinary floods, significant percentages of Pakistan's territory being underwater, just really apocalyptic stuff. Yeah, I haven't followed up on it recently, Jack. I don't have a ton to say about Pakistan. I do know that if we're looking for catastrophe related to the Russia-Ukraine war, if we're looking for places where folks will have trouble feeding themselves because they're dependent on imports, I'm not sure if Pakistan is dependent on agricultural imports. My hunch is yes, it is. I know that it's massively dependent on natural gas imports. Of course, that natural gas has been snaked away by Europe, which can pay more for it. Europe is not going to freeze to death this winter, but Pakistan is one of those countries that is most likely to experience suffering because of the natural gas that they rely upon is not coming anymore. It's going to Europe. Also, I think, as with Sri Lanka, Pakistan is just very much on the hook with the IMF at this point. I haven't paid attention to where those IMF negotiations are. As with Sri Lanka, I don't think Pakistan has defaulted yet, but if Pakistan is to avoid a default like Sri Lanka, it's going to need some kind of large IMF loan package. And I'm not sure how the negotiations for that are going, but I'm sure it's terrible. So yeah, that's all I have to say about Pakistan, Jack. Thank you for the super chat, but I unfortunately don't have anything in particular to say about that. Sean Yu, will the recent dramatic depreciation of the second tier currencies, Great Britain, Euro, Japan, cause fractures within the Western Bloc? That's a really interesting question. I think that I don't know. Finance, man, finance. The problem is that those, again, another incredible gift for Vladimir Putin is that those depreciations of those currencies also make those countries in the Western Bloc dramatically more dependent upon the United States. I think I did try to piece my mind, wrap my head around some description of how Japan's relationship to the United States led to their incredible currency depreciation or something along those lines. But if these, the Euro, Japan, or Great Britain were to step away from U.S. dependence, then these problems, U.S. swap lines, I believe, are something else I don't fully understand, but have a lot to do with shoring up those currencies. If they were to, you can make an argument that this is because of, to some degree, the depreciation of these currencies is due to these countries' reliance on the United States. You can make that argument. I think it's more likely and also true that you can blame this sort of thing on Vladimir Putin, but also this makes these countries weaker and more dependent on the United States. What's Japan going to do? Like say, actually, we don't want support from the Federal Reserve anymore, and can you take your bases away? I don't think that would lead to a rally in the yen. But I don't fully understand finance. I think, no question, it's a really, really interesting dynamic. I think that Britain's currency depreciation that we've seen over the past week is a result of bad government on their part. Japan is also the result of demographics, decades long. Interesting. You could argue that if the UK is instantly getting the result of a sort of conservative governments deciding to be extraordinarily extraordinarily expansive in terms of sort of tax cuts and spending money and no justification. Wasn't that sort of what Abenomics was? So maybe Great Britain is getting the instant reaction to some really dumb policies that are somewhat similar to the Abenomics that were attempted in Japan for a decade. So perhaps that depreciation is just a natural result of that, just over the course of a decade rather than a week. I don't know. Maybe that probably doesn't make any sense. But finance never makes any sense. So that's the thing. Like, I could certainly see people in Europe, Great Britain, and Japan being like, Jesus Christ, our currencies are turning into toilet paper. But I don't think it makes them any more likely to be independent of the United States. It just consolidates U.S. empire. It's a great question, though, and I should definitely research that further, Shania. Fado, the IMF stands by that the army should back off from the economy. CC is looking for alternatives in Japan and China, but they're unlikely to fund him. Are you talking about Pakistan? Or are you talking about Egypt? Because they're probably both the case. I think that's part of the Pakistan. I believe that's part of the Pakistan negotiation as well. Actually, Pakistani and Egyptian militaries are similarly very, very powerful in the economies of their countries. I think quite rightly seen as to the detriment of the economic success of Pakistan and Egypt. Countries that have a lot going for them in theory, population-wise, educated populace-wise, but continue to fail. And I think the IMF is not wrong to believe that the military control or interpenetration of the economy is a key part of that. Did I miss Fatal Super Chat? No. Wait, did I miss another one? Where did I miss another one? Oh, I did. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Iran is still much less of a challenge than Nasserist Egypt. Egypt managed to challenge the U.S. and MENA in ways Iran has not even gotten close to. Yes, but I think we're talking about a very different era. We're talking about, even in the 1970s and 80s, the United States was much less powerful. I would argue that in the 1950s, we saw sort of the end of the Cold War. Because in my mind, the Cold War was about the fact that the Soviet Union presented an attractive model and an attractive alternative. The idea that the Soviet Union had developed massively, had managed to crush the German war machine, and provided an alternative to the sort of capitalist empires that had crushed most of the global South. I believe in 1956, with Eisenhower opting not to back up those capitalist empires, combined with the Soviet Union in Hungary completely undermining any argument that it was for freedom. At that point, the serious Cold War ended, and United States victory was destined. But that did not mean that the United States was as powerful as it would be in the 1950s as it would become in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, 90s. And the U.S. has gone through this progressive consolidation of power, not progressive in a left-wing sense, but progressive as in growing, moving forward, consolidation of power. In 1956, in the 1950s and 1960s, Nasserist Egypt, because U.S. power had yet to become as all-encompassing as it is today, could obviously act as a much, much more serious threat to U.S. interests. There was a real possibility that Egypt could have destroyed Israel on a couple occasions. I think not as real as some may think, but I think that there was a real chance of that. There is no chance of Iran ever destroying Israel. Just not going to happen. That's one aspect. Egypt was able, because, again, this is because things were in such flux in early decolonization, there was a serious possibility, for a moment actually, Nasser united Egypt and Syria. But I don't know that that was necessarily an artifact of Nasser being that much more powerful than the Iranian regime today. I think that that was just an indicator of how much more fluid things were back in the period of early decolonization. Iran has infinitely more, I would say, not arguably, definitely has infinitely more influence in Lebanon and Syria today than Egypt had in Syria. I mean, Nasser was very popular across the Arab world in the 1950s, but in terms of just as the falling apart of the United Arab Republic between Egypt and Syria indicated, he didn't have much control of Syria on the ground or its elites or what have you. While what was I saying? While Iran today, I'd say arguably has massive control in Lebanon, not complete control in Lebanon, but much more serious power than Nasser ever had in Lebanon, very serious power in Syria. But there's no way that Iran could make a united country. I mean, they're Persians, not Arabs. But yeah, like it's just not a world that exists that has that fluidity anymore. So yeah, 100% I agree, Fadel, that like Nasser's Egypt was a much more real challenge to United States hegemony in the Middle East than Iran is. But I don't necessarily think that's because Nasser's Egypt was more powerful. I just think that's because things were more fluid back then in the period of, directly post-British, French, Ottoman, what have you. Okay. I think I answered that. Sorry for missing that super chat, Fadel. Dexton Min asks, do you think it would be smarter for the U.S. to pivot its foreign policy more towards the Americas rather than Europe in a positive way, though, of course. I think we should definitely never use that pivot language again. I think that the United States absolutely should reach out diplomatically to Latin America more, should fund more development in Latin America, should I think that the optics or rhetoric around a pivot is probably unwise. Doesn't have the best history. Obama's pivot to Asia, I think, hasn't really. I don't think of it as particularly great. But yeah, 100% we should do more in Latin America. We should make more friends. I think the most important thing to do would be to further demilitarize, further de-coerce, de-coercize? De-coerce our Latin American relationships. I think we need to open up to Cuba entirely, open up to Venezuela entirely. I think honestly, just taking those two steps, stop whining about Nicaragua. I think taking those steps would be tremendous steps forward for U.S. soft power in Latin America, and provide us with many more opportunities. I think actually it's sort of an incredible indication that things are going pretty well in Latin America. A clip from Chile's new young leftist president, something like that, going on at great length. I think making a morally accurate statements and good things, but also just very interesting that basically castigating the Chavez Maduro regime and saying that, well, if we're leftists who truly care about people, we should be willing to complain about our side or our political things. And just that breakdown of sort of anti-U.S. solidarity is something that we should really strongly encourage. And a way to do that would be to stop threatening to invade Venezuela, stop starving Venezuela, stop starving Cuba. If we just take those steps, and do nothing else, spend no new money in Latin America, I think we will find ourselves with a much, much friendlier and more successful Latin American policy. Let's see. Let's do a TikTok. What are we going to say on TikTok? Iran with other Middle East countries were relatively secular prior to U.S. intervention. No? Yeah, I mean, so Syria, before the massive U.S. Intervention in 2012, 13, 14, was a secular, was a much more secular oriented, very authoritarian. Yes, the Assad regime, never good people, but they were a lot more secular than the jihadists that currently run Idlib and are running the Turkish occupied areas of Syria. Iraq, obviously, infinitely more secular and solid under Saddam Hussein than it has been ever since. Yeah. It's bad when we intervene. Shout out to the Queen, sure. Are you surprised that Putin hasn't left a way out of himself to survive Ukraine loss? Yes, I am surprised that Putin just keeps doubling down. Putin really has doubled down here. I think that one thing that has definitely dissipated over the past 2 weeks with the announcement of the referendums and Russia's mobilization for war is the off-ramps have disappeared. The idea that there'd be some possible negotiated solution is pretty much over, and that's sad. Jay, the Australian government is hoping that Indonesia will become the next large economic market, replacing China. How likely do you think this is? I think that's great. I think that'd be a good thing. I think that'd be something that Australia could help happen. I think that that's a really smart, wise thing for Australia to do. For Australia to look for reasons to work more closely and help Indonesia become more affluent is a great thing for humanity. I believe Indonesia is the 4th or 5th largest, most populous country in the world. It would be great for humanity. It would be great for, actually, I was having an argument with somebody about this recently. I have to check this now. Asia population. 273 million. That is, where's Bangladesh? Bangladesh. Yep. Okay. Bigger than Bangladesh. Bigger than. So yeah, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. It is. I don't want to oversell it. There's tremendous problems with Indonesia. It's a tremendously diverse place, and there are certainly some folks who are repressed most foully. But it's also a place of tremendous economic success. And the more economically successful Indonesia becomes, the better it'll get for those minorities. And I think if Australia were to seriously be committed to helping Indonesia develop economically, it's a great, great thing for the world. And that would be great if it would continue to, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, so there's nothing. Is that right, though? I guess your question is that I think, yeah, I think Indonesia has been developing really quickly, has the potential to develop more quickly. I think if Australia in the long term is concerned about Chinese influence and Chinese um, infiltration into the Australian sphere of influence, then bulking up Indonesia is a great strategy. Because obviously the Indonesian government has its own relationship with China, but the more powerful that Indonesia is, the more two-sided that relationship can be. So yeah, I think that sounds very savvy, Jay. I wasn't aware of actions that the Australian government were taking in that direction, but they should be wholeheartedly applauded. Um, questions. Angel Balanzar asks, Syria was a Alawite Christian dictatorship that really should have let its Sunnis have some more empowerment before the war. Yeah, I can't argue with that. No question. This fucking really sad thing was that was already happening. Syria, Turkey, and Lebanon had made some kind of agreement that involved free movement of peoples. Assad was letting more outside businesses in. The last thing Syria needed at that point was a armed revolution, and that's what got heavily funded by the United States. And yeah, no, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, I'm not some gray zone idiot who's going to try and tell you that the Syrian regime was filled with nice people or something like that. That's not the case. It was and remains a violent dictatorship. It, however, was much more so, and still, even after all this death, remains a better alternative than a bunch of U.S. sponsored jihadists. Um, let's see. How is your camera tilting when you type? Yeah, my laptop is somewhat precariously positioned under on top of a bunch of books. Yeah, the Albo government has been trying to build closer ties. I need to look into that, Jay. Thank you. That's interesting and a positive thing. Angel Balanzar, free West Papua from racist Muslim rule of Indonesia, says Angel Balanzar. Yes, as I mentioned, there are definitely folks who are, what's the word I'm looking for? Indonesia is kind of a miraculous place in that it's still managed to be unified and been getting more prosperous. But yes, certainly its record out east with Timor-Leste and West Papua is pretty fucking grim. So yeah. I would not say free, generally speaking. I am not a big fan of changing borders, but yeah. Local Extreme, you've said that you can't speak confidently on South or Southeast Asia. What topics can you speak about with expertise? I mean, expertise overstates it, though I would say I certainly do a better job talking about the Middle East than most people who describe themselves as experts. Europe, I really honestly spend too much time reading about the history of Europe. Getting there on the United States. But yeah, and I mean, I think I speak a little too confidently about most everything. I think I'm kind of an arrogant sort. As I get older, I realize more and more that I have done more of the reading than almost anybody talking about foreign policy. I think there are tons of people, infinite numbers of people who are better, who know more about me, know more than me about a single country, like infinitely, like infinite people who know more than me about a single country. Academics, think tank people who make their careers studying a particular country and its challenges. Honestly, as like far as like someone who like looks at the big picture and tries to understand everything, I really don't. This is going to sound incredibly arrogant, but I just don't think there's anybody better than me. Sorry. I mean, I'm sure there are, but they're like, you know, um, sitting in academia somewhere or some think tank somewhere, being ignored. I don't really think there's anybody attempting to do public punditry like I am. Certainly not at any New York Times or Washington Post or anything like that who knows more about the world than I do. A little arrogant, but that's me. Um, um, do you think the U.S. should sign the JCPOA and why? And why not? Explain, please. Yes, 100%. We should have signed the JCPOA when the JCPOA is incredible. It's like the most one-sided arms control agreement in history. Like it's like we establish all this control and all this oversight over Iran about its nuclear program, and like, is the U.S. giving up any nuclear weapons? Like, is Israel giving up any nuclear weapons? Of course not. It's an incredibly one-sided, amazing deal in our favor, and anybody who tells you different is lying or is just stupid. Yeah. Of course, we should send the JCPOA. At this point, I can see, it was never in Iran's interest to sign this. And I think that at this point, now we're down to like only another 2 years before the likelihood of a Republican president. I don't see how it benefits Iran at all to sign it. I think the United States should totally sign the JCPOA, and should also, if the JCPOA is no longer possible, the U.S. should unilaterally remove all the Obama era sanctions. It's only in the Obama era, when the shale revolution made it possible, that anybody decided to put these country killing sanctions on Iran. We should allow people to buy oil and gas from Iran. We should remove all our sanctions, whether or not we get back in the JCPOA. Because as I talked about at length at the beginning of this, in this presentation, it's only U.S. aggression that keeps the Iranian theocracy going. Just as the little strongman performance that Putin and Xi Jinping have put together have just made their U.S. enemy infinitely more powerful. That's the main root of the continued existence of the Iranian theocracy is U.S. aggression. So yeah, we should send the JCPOA. I think we probably have lost the opportunity to do that by delaying so long. But we should just, if the JCPOA doesn't happen, we should just lift our sanctions on Iran. That would be the appropriate next step. We made it through, 30 years of the Islamic Republic without having Obama's sanctions on Iran. We can continue to go on without. And the history of U.S.-Iranian relations during the period of the Obama sanctions has been pretty bad, pretty universally bad. So yeah, we should just remove the Obama sanctions completely, whether or not we get back in the JCPOA. That's my position. Wade Wheelington II. Cy Berserk, that's a very aggressive name. The U.S. military recruitment struggles with overall health issues. Will the Terminators take over warfare? I've seen a lot of complaints about U.S. military recruitment recently, but like, what do we need soldiers for anymore? The Terminators have already taken over warfare. I think that, the U.S. military, there are aspects of the institution that are worthwhile. I think the U.S. should continue to have a military. But what of our current interventions actually needs soldiers? Can't think of any. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I'm not particularly worried about U.S. military recruitment. Sorry, yeah, it's rare to see him boast. I should not be that arrogant. That's very, that's hubris. But yeah, I think just generally speaking, obviously, I'm better at this than anybody else. Um, let's see. Do, 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 do. Angel Ballanzar says, Rob, I think the Democrats are a little too optimistic on the midterms. I think that is a huge mistake. I think the Republicans might win more than I'd expected. That would be disappointing if true. I think, Angel Ballanzar, I think you are potentially entirely correct on that. I think that, was it Matt Iglesias has been talking about, like, why are we getting so excited about these polls? It seems like these are exactly the same polls that, we got excited about and got burned by in 2020 and 2016. I do think there's a couple things that militate against that. I think that the folks that the Democrats won in 2020 are actually the people that tend to vote, more affluent suburban folks that tend to vote in midterms. But it's entirely possible that Republicans are also being massively motivated. Fuck, yeah, I don't know. I tend to think that the Democrats will hold on to the Senate, and might even hold on to the House of Representatives, but nothing about that is guaranteed. It's entirely possible that Angel Ballanzar is entirely right. It's entirely possible that by January of, in February of 2020, 2023, all we're going to be talking about is the impeachment of Joe Biden, or investigations into Hunter Biden, and that's all that U.S. politics is going to be about for the next 2 years. That's very possible. So yeah, I think that's definitely something you should be worried about. But maybe that'd be good for the world, right? That's the only thing that can derail U.S. Empire is its obsession with nitpicking itself. There will be major protests in Iraq on October 1st, says Fado. Man, Iraq. I guess all I can say really is good luck. Daxton I really hope the bottom 80% gets a break soon. I think that it did a bit. Biden has done nowhere near enough. But what is interesting about recent Biden stuff is that there have actually been small chips in the support of the bottom 80% of the United States. The removal of college debt, on very is very carefully tailored to target to target folks who are not the wealthy people who went to college. A lot of people targeted who didn't finish college. So I think that was a good thing. I think that there are aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act that actually took some positive steps on healthcare and whatnot. Baby steps, but it does seem like a few things are being done. Yeah, Angel Ballinger says recent Biden stuff needs to happen more. I think it's very true. Aaron Pod asks, do you think the Iranian regime will fall? I think it will fall eventually. Will it fall as a result of these Masa Amini protests? I think probably not. Okay, I think we're coming into, yeah, oh, it's been 2 hours. Okay, so Trump is the cause for the aggression, not Obama. That's wrong, actually. Obama was very aggressive. It's Obama that put these starvation sanctions against Iran. It's Obama that started the pivot to China, pivot to Asia. Looks like the UK is more dysfunctional than the US. That's been true for a long time. The PP loans was just a corrupt giveaway. I disagree on that, actually. I think there was certainly corruption in there, but it also kind of saved the world economy, among other things in the CARES Act. My name is Robert Morris. I do, so I guess, geopolitical analysis, I suppose. A little bit of domestic politics thrown in now and again. I try to do something every Tuesday, whether it's a live chat or a produced video. I also do daily shorts now, which is kind of exhausting me. But yeah, you can follow me on the YouTube at Mo Freedom Foundation, TikTok and Instagram at More Freedom Foundation. The conversation keeps going all day long at Robbo Law on Instagram. And oh wow! Since my previous question made you inadvertently boast, how about you tell us which predictions you got wrong to even it out? I definitely was wrong. I thought the EU would collapse in 2014, 2015. I think I was wrong about that. I was entirely right that Russia was incapable of conquering Ukraine. I've got a video entitled that from a year and a half ago. What I was wrong about, as I think many others were, was I assumed that Russia had a real military, and I thought that Russia's failure to conquer Ukraine would come about it through like insurgency. I did not expect that Russia was so weak that it would be in the position it is now, still desperately fighting a conventional war with the Ukrainians that I, like everybody else, dramatically underestimated. So I got that wrong. Um, Back in 2015, I one of the worst videos I ever made. I advocated for breaking up. I advocated breaking up Iraq. I've subsequently decided that was a stupid thing, and I've become really suspicious of anybody who wants to talk about, independence movements or redrawing maps. And I've come to believe that that's almost always a terrible idea, largely from the experience of South Sudan. But yeah, no, that oh man, my Iraq coverage generally is just kind of shit. Like sort of very bad. Whereas my 2014 Ukraine videos strike me as just like brilliantly prescient. My Iraq videos from 2014 are pretty crappy. I was a little sort of swept up by, the craziness of the Islamic State thing. Yeah, I think I've got a lot of bad videos about Iraq from 2014, 2015, which is like, I think part of the reason why, despite Fadel's best efforts, I'm really reluctant to talk about Iraq because I think I screwed it up, my analysis of it so badly. Um, I definitely expected Tunisian democracy to fail. I got that right. Yemen, I was right about Yemen's war essentially being over. I was right about Syria being over. Yeah, I'm not wrong on much. No, the 2020 election. I predicted a massive defeat for Donald Trump, and it was not a massive defeat for Donald Trump. I got that wrong. Yeah, I believe the polls. I thought that there was more of a backlash against Trump than there was. Truly, Biden barely won a majority in Congress, and that was surprising to me. I got that wrong. Yeah, but I don't honestly make a ton of predictions. Um, that's a good way to not be wrong as often. Like, because I think making predictions is pretty stupid. Generally. Um, I mean, Saudi Arabia is definitely finished by 2030. That's a prediction I'm very confident and happy to make. Let's see. Low Cool Extreme. Join the Patreon to get this. Yes, okay. Please show up here every Tuesday to see what I'm doing. Please show up here every day to see new shorts or what have you. I skipped Saturday last weekend because I was out on a boat. Very scary boat ride, actually. Yeah, please support me on Patreon. That keeps this channel going. Also, if you join Patreon, you get access to our patrons only Discord channel, which is something that I didn't know what it was about 6 months ago, but folks convinced me to adopt, and I think it's awesome. It's a Discord server that's only for the patrons, so it's really only for people who really care about geopolitics. I think the conversations that happen there are fascinating. Folks over there just making me aware of stuff I didn't know about. Once a month on the Discord server, we have like sort of like a Zoom chat. I don't prepare anything, but we just sort of shoot the shit. It's kind of fun. Really like seeing the voices, seeing the faces, hearing the voices, the folks that support this channel. Also, you can just lurk on that if you're a patron, if you prefer. So yeah, definitely sign up for Patreon if you want to keep this going. What else? You can also donate on PayPal. That's cool too. But even if you can't donate, your likes, your subscribes, your comments everywhere are tremendously important to. I wrote a book called Avoiding the British Empire, which sort of, to my mind, explains everything. You can find that on Amazon. That's Avoiding the British Empire. Also, Everybody's Lying About Islam. I wrote about, geez, 6 years ago now. That explains how most of what we used to call terrorism was mostly about the U.S.-Saudi relationship. But that feels like the distant past now. And yeah, hopefully next week I should have something talking about. Um, Everyone is missing the play MBS is making. I'm not missing the play MBS is making. I don't think he's making one. No, that's not true. MBS is like, it's sort of like kind of like Louis the 16th. It's like things are going to look really good until financial catastrophe happens, and then things aren't going to look so good. Yes, hit the like button. Likes are good. Likes, engagement, subscription, all of that's good. What are your thoughts, Iran? Saudi Arabia is definitely finished in 2030. I'm not waffling, man. My analysis of the oil and gas market leads me to believe that Saudi Arabia is finished by 2030. I've got extensive documentation of that claim up at the YouTube channel. Israel has not infiltrated the American political system. Israel is an outgrowth of the American political system. The Likud party works for me, the U.S. investor. Israel is a destabilization machine, and that's what helps get U.S. investors paid. The UAE is not going to win the war. Anyway, okay, so I've been doing this for about 2 hours, so I think it's time for me to bail. All right, thanks for being here, and thanks for participating. Y'all are the best in the stream.